Hello and welcome to the Jo's Art History Podcast, a podcast which celebrates all things art historical every single day. On today's podcast, I sit down with Rebecca Milford to talk about one of her favourite artists and a complete icon, Frida Kahlo. As an art historian, Frida Kahlo is somebody that I knew a little bit about, but I really couldn't sit down and discuss her at length and as enthusiastically and as knowledgeably as what Rebecca is about to do. In this podcast, we discuss her tempestuous relationship with her husband Diego, her life filled with pain due to an accident that she had when she was 18, and also her artistic outpour, and just how important she was at showing, really for the first time within art history, the pain and suffering that women go through just purely from being women. If you're anything like me, you'll know Frida as someone who is quite iconic and is someone that perhaps you don't know her by name, but you'll definitely know her to look at. She's very distinctive in her sort of facial features, and that she's very well known for having this incredible monobrow or very sort of distinct eyebrows. And she's someone who spent a lot of her life painting self-portraits because, as Frida said herself, she was so often alone and it was the subject that she knew best. So I invite you now to sit back and relax as Rebecca and I delve into the incredible life of the Mexican painter, Frida Kahlo. Kind of first and foremost, why Frida Kahlo?
Why Frida? That's a great question. I think she is known in popular culture these days as such a feminist icon and one of the most famous Mexican painters. And we obviously all know her from the unibrow. But for me, it came about when I took a trip to Mexico about 4 years ago and went to the Casa Azul, which is the blue house where she spent a lot of her life, and it's now been turned into a museum, and really saw these paintings up close and got a feeling for the vibrancy in them, the life in them. And we were lucky enough to have a guide who could tell us a lot about Frida's life. And he kind of revealed where a lot of her inspiration comes from and how so much of it is focused on this pain that she felt throughout her life, both physical and emotional. And it just really, really moved me because it's this self-expression and this beautiful artwork that comes from real trauma and like quite a savage experience all throughout her life. And yeah, it just really, really touched me that these pieces of work could be such an incredible legacy from someone that never shied away from death. Like, she was presented with it for so much through her life. And I think that's why a lot of her paintings make us feel slightly uncomfortable at first, but then you really do kind of feel them tug at something deep within you, because it's kind of almost representation of our own mortality as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have this kind of scary, surrealist, nightmarish sort of vibe to them. But you really do need to sort of understand her backstory, I think, to sort of really understand. Or, I mean, they can still sort of star something, but I really think once you sort of understand the complete roller coaster of her life, particularly sort of around her health, completely tragic, but like she's an absolute trooper, really. She's a complete warrior, and that she really kept going. And it's something that, so I studied art history, but we didn't really touch on her very much when I was studying. And it was actually the V&A exhibition a few years ago, where I came across her, where it was where they had just recently uncovered all these incredible dresses and things that had been locked away at the request of her husband Diego for 50 years after his death. And it was when they found all these things, and then they started doing this tour of the world, and obviously came to the V&A, that I just thought, my God, this woman's incredible. And I completely get what the fascination is with her. Like, she's just amazing.
And you've sort of nailed it there when you say she was a trooper. Like, she was such a warrior. She had to live with this pain and these injuries throughout her life. Was desperately in love with this man Diego, who had multiple affairs, cheated on her with her own sister, even to the extent that they ended up getting a divorce after 10 years of marriage. But then she remarried him a year later because it was almost like she couldn't live without him. She he was her twin flame almost. But and she still created these amazing images that seem to, for me, kind of have one foot in life and one foot in death constantly. Like that's almost how she seems to have lived her life. And I think you really do get a sense of that when you look at them and when you kind of explore the inspiration behind each one.
That's an amazing way to put it, actually. One foot in life and one, that's just kind of like nail on the head for me. Like that's just it, exactly. So can you tell us a little bit about Frida's upbringing and her childhood and where sort of these health issues sort of stemmed from?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of people attribute her interest in politics and communism to when she married Diego, and that was a huge effect on her. But she was always like a very forward-thinking woman, always very strident in her own beliefs and very politically active at school. She joined the Young Communist League when she was younger and the Mexican Communist Party. And so she always kind of really had this strong sense of will and a strong sort of sense of self-belief and a desire for social change, I suppose. But then in 1925, when she was 18, she was on a bus and it had a collision with a tram, and it was like this awful, like atrocious collision, and this metal spike, I think it's like a steel handrail, impaled her, and so it went through her back and through her pelvis, and her spine and her pelvis were both broken in like multiple places. It crushed her foot, it broke her collarbone, and these would go on to have effects like for the rest of her life. She was bedridden for a huge amount of time. She had trouble conceiving, so they never actually had children because of, like how frail her body was. She was in a cast, a really sort of like painful cast, very restrictive cast for lots of her life. So she kind of like from the age of 18 onwards until her death had to deal with this constant pain. And you really do see that in a lot of her paintings. Like you see the emotional depth of the pain, and that inspires a lot of the themes of death and decay and like mortality, and sort of like torture almost. But I think what also like really fascinated me when I learned about it was that it's not just the themes that her injury had a huge effect on, it's actually like the form itself. So lots and lots of Frida's paintings, and also her most famous ones, are all self-portraits. And one of the reasons for that is when she was recovering at home, her parents had a mirror installed in the canopy of her bed, and her mum commissioned this special easel so she could paint from kind of like lying down. So the reason why so many of her paintings are self-portraits is because she was staring up at herself for so long when she was bedridden and when she was kind of trying to recover. And so it is literally like self-reflection in these paintings. She's like kind of looking to herself for inspiration. She's lying there wounded, trying to heal, trying to make sense of things. And so I feel like so much of these paintings are us really getting a look into what was going on in her head as she was trying to make sense of this.
There's one in particular that when we sort of spoke about doing this podcast called The Broken Column, which you'd kind of earmarked as one to potentially talk about. So why this painting in particular for you is quite important and sort of the cornerstone of Frida's sort of body of work?
I think one of the reasons I love this painting so much is like the juxtaposition of frailty and being exposed. So just for a bit of reference, it's this painting of her from the waist up. I think originally she was supposed to be naked, but now kind of a sheet, it could be a hospital bed sheet, kind of covers her lower part. But it's kind of her naked from the waist up, and it shows this cutaway where you would see the spine, and instead of the spine you see this crumbling white column. So it's quite a powerful painting because even in the way that she's standing, like her shoulders are quite straight and she's looking directly at you, like there's something quite defiant about it. But it's also like incredibly vulnerable because you're seeing her insides and like this crumbling white column that signifies where the crippling injuries were that she would still suffer from. And also in this painting, she's kind of got these little nails stuck all over her, into her face and all over her body. And in this kind of like cavity, it's like bright scarlet behind this white column. And it should be this gruesome painting, you know, even in the way you're describing it, these words are all kind of like really harrowing. But there's something so strong about it, even though the column itself is breaking inside her, that kind of shows that her body isn't keeping her up and isn't keeping her well. Like, it's the way that she's looking at the viewer and does have her head held high. And I just think it's such an incredible image of resistance, of like, even if my body is broken, then my mind is not, and my will is not.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And even where she's kind of placed herself as well, even though you said that she, you know, she's got this hospital bed sheet kind of almost wrapped around her waist, but she's standing in this sort of very sort of jagged and broken landscape, really, which kind of echoes the sort of brokenness of her body. And she has these very faint tears sort of lightly sort of rolling down her face, but she's not in pain in this image as well, just kind of like what you said, like she's so sort of strong and defiant and just completely resistant to the pain. And it's an unbelievable piece.
It really is. I think is that, yeah, the tears, and yet she's still so composed. And yeah, I think it really does kind of like represent her fortitude in a way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this was painted quite late on, actually, in Kahlo's life. So this painting that we're discussing was painted in 1944. And just for anyone listening to the podcast, as always, all the images we discuss will be able to view on my Instagram page, and I'll leave a link to that in the show notes below. And I'll also leave a link to my website where you can view them there if you don't Instagram, which is absolutely fine if you don't. But yeah, just I think for me, this is such an interesting work. And after she'd gone through so much, because as well, like her personal life, as you said, with her partner was incredibly tempestuous and very fiery, as well as dealing with all these sort of health issues. There was also a lot of, not love loss per se, but there was a lot of drama in her personal life.
Oh yeah, a huge amount of drama in her personal life. Like, she didn't have anything easy. She fell in love with Diego, who was this, you know, a revolutionary, and she fell in love with him for his mind and his soul. Apparently, I think there are some references to him looking a bit like a toad. Like, he's not a good looking guy. And if you look at any photos of them, she's this tiny little woman and he's like this huge, almost quite grotesque man. But he was a real kind of forward thinker. And I think that's what probably attracted her to him. And he was 20 years older than her, and they tried to have a baby, and then she had a miscarriage, so she kind of had to deal with that pain as well, and the pain of all of his betrayals. So yeah, it's like her kind of life was littered with these heartaches one way or the other.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And when you see them both together, they're a very striking pair, but they're a very odd pair. Her mother hated Diego, but her dad, because he was so well established, as you said, he was 20 years her senior. He was quite a famous mural painter in Mexico, and because he was quite wealthy, her father approved of the marriage, because he was like, oh, she can take care of her. But their mother used to refer to them as the elephant and the dove.
I know, it's so funny.
But I was like, also, only mother-in-laws could really get away with saying something so like cutting.
I know, yeah. I think he probably just took it on the chin, but still, he was definitely not a fan. And you know, when you learn that he had an affair with Frida's own sister, you do kind of think, come on, dude.
Yeah, there's crossing the line. No, absolutely. So you mentioned there that Frida actually suffered a miscarriage, and there's a very, very famous painting that Frida made after her miscarriage, which is quite haunting, actually, and it's called the Henry Ford Hospital. Have I got the name of this?
Yeah, that one's right. It's also known as the floating bed. And yeah, she had the miscarriage in 1932, and she also painted this like very shortly after. And you're right, harrowing and haunting is exactly the words. It kind of shows a naked, twisted Frida, still bloated from pregnancy, on a hospital bed, and there are these red ribbons that look kind of like, I suppose, umbilical cords or veins, and they're coming from her, and floating around the bed are these 6 objects. And one of them is a snail to kind of show how slow the operation and the abortion was. One of them is a pelvic bone that kind of illustrates her crippled body and what went wrong. And one of them is a fetus to show the unborn child. And apparently she actually requested, about a week after the miscarriage, she requested the fetus from the hospital because she wanted to paint it directly, but they refused her. So she had to make do with medical illustrations.
Like you can't say she wasn't of a strong disposition. My goodness.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's also a couple of other things there. There's like a wilted flower that's there, and then something also that looks like, I think, is it a lock and key or something? It's a very sort of weird.
I think it's
object,
like hospital machinery. It's kind of supposed to signify the hospital, and it was also in the Henry Ford Hospital in the States. So that's like what the backdrop is as well. You kind of like see, and the Ford manufacturing plant as well. So I think for me that really signifies how far she felt from home when this was happening. Like, she wasn't in her beloved Mexico, and she wasn't surrounded by the traditions and the comforting things that she knew. So it's a real sign of alienation.
Yeah, because they moved to the States for Diego because he was given several commissions, but Frida missed Mexico, so she moved back after a few years. But I think that was not really round about the breakup of their marriage, because, like you said, they divorced in 1939. But it kind of takes us on to another painting which you brought to my attention, called The Two Fridas.
Yeah, so this kind of represents Frida's pain in a different way. This is more of an emotional pain. And at first, I think when she painted it, she said that it was from kind of like a dream or a memory she had of this imaginary friend when she was younger. But then she acquiesced a bit later on that it was due to the emotional turmoil she felt after divorcing from Diego. But it kind of shows these two versions of herself sitting almost facing each other. And one of them is in very traditional Mexican dress. And this one is shown with an exposed, broken heart. And this heart is like bleeding all over her lap. And in the other version, she's in modern dress with a whole heart. And it kind of shows the two sides of her personality and her desperation and loneliness, and how she really, she wants to follow her heart, but her heart lies with Diego, and this causes her pain. And so it's kind of, for me, her trying to make sense of, well, how can you follow your heart if you know that's taking you down a route of sadness?
In the portrait where she's sitting in traditional dress, she's also sort of holding in her hand a very small amulet with a photo of Diego when he was a child, and they sit against this very stormy backdrop, which for me, it's all about that, how even though she's in two minds, clearly, that she has strength in herself and that she can make a decision and will follow her heart eventually. I think it's so interesting because, that you mentioned previously, it was a very fiery relationship. He cheated on her several times, but their divorce also follows some of Frida's infidelity as well. She had an affair with Leon Trotsky, a very famous Russian revolutionary.
Well, she had multiple affairs as well, actually, with men and women. So, she wasn't exactly completely
angel of virtue.
But no, he was actually staying with her in the Casa Azul, in the Blue House. So this was a period in Diego and Frida's life where they had a lot of revolutionaries and artists and writers that would come around to their house and talk about sort of revolutionary ideas. And Trotsky was in Mexico because he'd been exiled from Russia, and he was staying at Casa Azul, and his wife was over as well, so she was in the picture, but Frida had an affair with him. Yeah.
Blue House is quite an interesting place. Like you said, they had a lot of artists that have coming and going, but it really was the hub of Frida's existence almost, and her artistic outpour. So she was born in this house, and obviously she lived with Diego in this house, and she died in this house as well. But what I think is so incredible is how vibrant the entire house is. I mean, I've never been fortunate enough, like yourself, to visit there, but I watched a sort of virtual sort of walkthrough, and the house is just incredible.
It's just beautiful. It is that kind of bright peacock blue that almost seems too blue. Your eyes can't really take it in. and it's got like a courtyard in the middle. It's very traditionally built, and it's got sort of fountains and flora everywhere, and you can kind of walk around the grounds, and you can kind of really imagine her going out and kind of sitting there in the morning with her coffee and her breakfast of tamales, and she had pet monkeys, so they would kind of be running around, and there were parrots and birds, and you really do sense what you're surrounded by when you go there. And I think that's why I love it as well, because although there are these harrowing and disturbing paintings that she does, a lot of her self-portraits, especially the kind of ones from the shoulders up, there are a lot of flowers and greenery and parrots and monkeys, and these, it's almost like love letters to Mexico and to the Casa Azul. So for all of the paintings that are quite dark and show her grief and her pain, there are equally ones that show how much she loved life and how appreciative she was to be surrounded by this.
Well, that's it, exactly. And she's someone who very famously is known for her striking looks and her appearance and her sense of dress. And there's all this, I mean, reading before recording with you, I was reading this thing where they said that she preferred these sort of traditional Mexican dresses because when she was working abroad, it showed her love of her home nation and sort of let her stand out in a crowd almost. And she really did love that. And she used to wear these incredible hair bands and style her hair very high as a way of sort of drawing attention away from her lower body. Because she had also which I don't think we've mentioned, she suffered polio as well as a small child. So she walked with a limp, and then she had this horrendous accident when she was 18, which then continuously caused her health grievances throughout her life. But yeah, this house is just for someone who suffered so much. To look at this house instantly, it's just this very joyous and welcoming, very strange place, really. But like you said, it's you can just kind of picture her moving around the space, and everything about it is worthy of an artwork. And it's now the Frida Kahlo Museum.
It is, yeah, and it's a stunning place to go, because you really, really do get this feeling of how she did love life. You know, she had a very vibrant life in some senses. There was just also a lot of pain in it. Yeah. So, and this is where she did die, as you mentioned, just sort of 20 days after her 47th birthday. And this was also where she painted her final painting, which is called Long Live Life, Viva la Vida. And I think that kind of really goes to show how she appreciated the time that she was here, even though there was so much pain in it.
Yeah, that's it. And her final painting is really interesting, actually. So we've spoken about the previous works. They're quite dark. There's a lot of pain and sadness being portrayed to the viewer. But this one is really interesting and very different to the others that we've discussed. It's a still life of watermelons, which is a complete curveball. When you sent me this, I was like, oh, okay, we like a curveball.
Oh yeah, I love this painting. I love it so much. It's kind of like watermelons, and they're slightly cracked open, so they're bursting open, and they're ripe, and you've got that sort of like striped greenery of the outer shell, and then inside that sort of like rich reddy pink of the juicy flesh of the watermelon and the dark gleaming seeds. And one of the reasons for watermelons is the association with the Day of the Dead. So traditionally, watermelons would be eaten on the Day of the Dead, which is in Mexico, a day when people celebrate their ancestors and celebrate their loved ones who have passed on. And so she painted it like knowing that she was going to die soon. And in this way, she's kind of showing that she's ready for her soul to pass on, and this understanding that she will also be remembered. And one of the other kind of things that I learned that I love is that just days before her death, just like around the time when she finished this painting, she wrote in her diary, I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return. And I just thought that's so beautiful.
Yeah, it really is. And it's such a wonderful final work as well. Particularly, this is a detail I didn't actually realise when first looking at it, is that the sky is split. So it's kind of one half of the work is nighttime, like a very deep dark blue, and the other half is sort of a morning sky, a very light clear blue. So I think again that just really, it really works with the whole idea of that she knew it was her time to sort of pass over, or that death was needing. Because the sort of years, so from sort of like 1950 onwards, she had a lot of operations on her spine. Her leg was eventually amputated as well due to complications. And what's really sad at this point as well is she was actually gaining international recognition as an artist. Yeah, isn't it?
She was
Isn't it?
Diego's, Diego, the famous painter's wife, for much of her own life. And then it's only after her death that Diego's kind of become the husband of Frida. So yeah, that's the way it goes.
What's amazing is in 1939, she sold a work to the Louvre. She was the first Latin American female Latin American artist to sell a work to the Louvre. And in 1953, so a year before she sadly passed away, she had her first solo exhibition in Mexico, but she was so ill. She was advised by her doctors not to attend, but she was so devastated at the thought not being able to go to her first solo exhibition in her home country that she attended in her hospital bed.
Fantastic. It just shows her strength of will and her strength of spirit, doesn't it? I mean, I love that story. It pretty much exemplifies her determination in life.
Really, from sort of researching for this podcast, I'm just like, my goodness, what a woman. She was just incredible. So she passed away in 1954, and there's a lot of debate around how she died. So some people say it was pneumonia. Some people say that she took an accidental overdose of painkillers because she was on quite a high dose of medication. But Diego died a couple of years later, and it was in his will that he said that he wanted the house to be turned into a museum, which I just think's really incredible. And Frida's ashes are still there, actually, and kind of coming back to something that you said earlier. They're in this little sort of toad vase, and that was a toad vase, and that's because of Diego's sort of nickname for himself with Frida, sort of "I'm your toad," which I think's a really nice sort of full circle from what you said earlier in the podcast. Is there anything else that you think, oh my goodness, we haven't spoken about, and this is a really important thing that people need to know about Frida? Because she really is this incredible sensation now, to the point, like you said earlier, you know of her to see her, but you potentially don't know the name. She's very sort of iconic.
So iconic. And she's on everything now, from tote bags to t-shirts and mugs and things. And yeah, she has become this feminist icon, and I don't know how much of that has got to do with the fact people like Madonna have collected pieces of her artwork and things. Yeah. But I think what is important for me is people also look into the reasons of why she created these works, because there's so much more to her than just being a feminist or a communist. It's, you know, it's to do with this inherent pain that she had through her life. And the way it always makes me think of is that phrase, like, when you're near death, then your life flashes before your eyes. And I feel like she was so like continuously near death that these paintings are her sort of like showing her life flashing, and we get to see them. So I feel that it's a real privilege to be able to look at them in that sense.
I would completely agree with your sentiment of people. Yeah, I would definitely recommend that people go away and look into her, because she lived a short life. She didn't live very long, but for what she did do, she definitely she packed it full of interesting. She packed it full of interesting people, and for someone who was, you know, in crippling pain and technically disabled for most of her life. She had back braces, and when they opened up the museum, they found a lot of sort of prosthetic legs and things like that. So for someone who was technically disabled, that really wasn't how she identified as. She lived her life, and I think that's just really, really incredible.
Yeah.
And just surprised of how ill she was. Yeah, it's and particularly, like you said, when she had her accident and when her easel was fitted to her bed and she could paint herself in the mirror. Like, I just think it's just an amazing sort of show of resilience. And I just think she's an incredible person.
Completely. I mean, if you think if you or I kind of feel a bit iffy and we're in bed, I can just about turn on Netflix. So to have the fortitude to think I'm going to create something from this, it just really puts it in perspective.
Rebecca, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and speaking so amazingly and passionately about Frida Kahlo. And I really appreciate your time and your wealth of knowledge that you've shared with us. Before you go, I do have one final question. It is the Jo's Art History podcast after all. So my final question, and you can take this as large or as sort of small as you want, really. But my final question is, why is art important?
Why is art important? For me, art is important because we're all trying to make sense of the world. We're trying to make sense of our own existences on a larger scale as well. And I feel like art gives us a chance to recognize in ourselves what other people are feeling too. So it kind of stops us feeling that little bit lonely.
I'm loving asking people this question. I'm getting so many sort of varied responses. It's so great. Thank you so much. Before you go, Rebecca, where can people find you?
So I actually have an account that is to do with astrology and crystal healing. So you can find me on Cosmic Cures, actually Cosmic_Cures. And on that, it's a lot of that is about female empowerment and life motivation and things. So I think that's probably why I resonate with Frida as well. I feel like she was really trying to do the best for herself and for other women out there.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, particularly because it's a Friday night.
It was great fun. Thank you for having me on. And it got me to revisit some of my favourite pieces of artwork as well, which I haven't looked at in a while. So I really appreciate you asking me. Thank you.
And there you have it, the end of another episode of the Jo's Art History podcast. I would just like to take this opportunity once again to thank Rebecca for coming on and speaking so passionately about the life and work of Frida Kahlo. I really hope you've learned a thing or two. I know I certainly have. And I feel a greater appreciation now more than ever, having spent some time reading into this woman's incredible life. And I would once again urge you to seriously go away and do some digging and diving of your own into the life and works of Frida Kahlo. In preparation for this podcast, I came across some incredible videos on YouTube, and I'll link a couple of them below in the show notes, as well as a link to my Instagram page and my website, which will show you all the works that we discussed in the podcast. If you would like to get in touch, please do. You can email me, joesarthistory@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram @joesarthistory. And I will leave a link below to Rebecca's Instagram page in the show notes too. Finally, if you have enjoyed this episode and think perhaps someone else you know would enjoy listening to, please do feel free to pass it on. And hey, why not, while you're doing that, like, rate and subscribe to the series, which means you will never miss another episode. And apparently it also helps other people find the podcast. Also, if you were able to do so, I would be really grateful if you could leave a review to the show, just so I know. Feedback's always helpful. Finally, thank you so much for listening, and I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. I've been Jo McLaughlin, your host and friendly art historian, and I look forward to welcoming you next time on the Jo's Art History podcast. Until then, keep learning, and remember, art is for all.